all have heard the spiel about, who Maine Community Development Association is, so I'm going to bypass that this morning since we're a couple of minutes late and get right into the idea that John Egan had presented previously for us, and people were very interested in what he had to say, and he had enough additional information to be able to present for at least another hour, if not, I'm not sure how much longer, but so we enticed him into coming back to give us some more information on financing for housing. So, John, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Good morning, everyone. My name is John Egan. I'm with Genesis Community Loan Fund. We're based in Brunswick. We are a nonprofit CDFI lender focused entirely on affordable housing and community facilities. We also do technical assistance. That's the side of the organization that I sit on with a couple of others. And so we're pleased to be able to provide technical assistance workshops. We have a couple of contracts that provide support for that. One of them is with Maine Housing that focuses specifically on communities, organizations, for-profit, nonprofit, builders, landowners, construction companies, anybody that's interested in building housing that has some kind of affordable housing component to it. And may or may not, doesn't have to pursue Maine housing financing, but our role is to get those organizations queued up and inform about the pathways that Maine housing requires for applications and kind of walk folks through that process, which can be very different if you haven't worked with Maine housing before. They describe themselves as a $3 billion bank. But as a public organization serving a public benefit, they have some different requirements. And our job is to sort of translate those requirements and help people figure out how to put projects together and apply for funding. This morning's topic is on how to build a pro forma, which is one of the key elements for being able to organize around a project idea to get other parties interested. You have to show some feasibility, and oftentimes that is a mathematical or a spreadsheet illustration of the numbers associated with the project. So I'm going to walk through a couple of slides, but really what the purpose of today's conversation is to get into a conversation back and forth with you all. I think that's where the real learning and insights come through. So I'm going to go through about 9 or 10 slides, and then we can get to that conversation piece. So I just have to hit the share button here. All right, can you all see that now? Great. So how to build a pro forma. First, I'm required to start with a little bit of a Genesis commercial. I briefly explained who we are. This slide goes in the front of every one of the presentations that we do out in the community. So it describes who we are. That's a photograph from last year of our board and staff at our office in Brunswick on a really nice sunny summer day. As a nonprofit CDFI, we essentially are a lender that makes money. We earn our income to keep the lights on from borrowing money at lower rates than we loan them out to the community. We have a couple of federal pass-through, although those are always a little bit shaky these days. Funding sources from the Treasury Fund, the CDFI fund, but most of our money in the Genesis Fund are investments and loans to the organization to provide us capital to make opportunities happen in communities in Maine and increasingly in northern New Hampshire and a couple of places in Vermont as well. So just trying to lighten it up a little bit here early in the morning. Pro forma, I like to say, is Latin for let me see your numbers again. It comes really in two stages. There's a pre-development phase where you're ironing on these numbers and you're assembling and refining and going through various iterations There very well might be 8 or 10 of those that you go through before you get to a final settled budget that everybody agrees upon. And then you go through and you follow that pro forma budget through the development process. And that's an interesting point to make, in that something that is very volatile and sort of dynamic for a number of months while you're putting the project together, it really does get to a place where it's locked down when you get to the closing. And then everybody that's on your project, all the partners that are involved, really expect you or the developer to follow that pro forma and adhere to the assumptions that we started the project with. Of course, no construction or renovation project ever follows the budget exactly the way it's been laid out at closing, but that's why you have a couple of rubber bands in there to provide some elasticity for contingency and moving things around. But essentially, the pro forma is a mathematical illustration of how the project comes together, how it gets paid for, and most importantly, how the lenders get paid back. The three primary components, and there's, depending on the complexity of your deal, there can be more segments of it, but for most of the projects at smaller scale, community level, there's an operating budget, there's a proposed construction or renovation budget, and then there's the sources and uses. And most lenders and or funding sources are really interested in seeing your illustration of all three of these parts of the project. They're kind of like three sides of the project, and they absolutely all tie together. As you go through the iterations, the idea is that your numbers get firmer and closer to reality, so that when you get to a closing, you can actually execute documents on the presentation of those numbers. And again, like I said, move forward with it, expecting that you'll stay as close to that budget as you possibly can. It always takes longer than we think, right? Projects are always dragging out. Part of that is because you want to make sure, as either the owner or the developer, that you really do have the pro forma firmed up as certain as you can. Nobody likes to go into a construction project thinking that they have a $300,000 cost item, only to find out it's a $600,000 cost item. So we try and flesh those things out beforehand, which is why the pro forma goes through a whole bunch of iterations. But we try and encourage folks to not get specific about the particulars of the site or the design until after you've had a discussion either with your group or your owner or internal to your organization on exactly what it is that you're trying to accomplish, whether it's a new construction or a renovation. Really understand what you're trying to accomplish first, or else sometimes what can happen is your vision and your idea of the project ends up getting steered, sometimes unintentionally or inconsequentially, towards something that you weren't really set out to start with, and either a site condition or a budget or a funding source ends up steering the organization. So we try and encourage folks, before you start building the budget numbers around a particular site or a particular existing building that you're going to renovate, to really understand the vision and capacity of what you're trying to accomplish. There's a whole bunch of free material that's out there on data to help you start and get some initial placeholders in your pro forma before you have to start paying consultants. That's often a role that I get to play at Genesis. I can provide some feedback to people that are just starting out, just to give them a frame of reference to get the numbers on planet Earth. And they can start talking about what the rents might be and what the construction costs might be in very round numbers, just to see if there's even initial feasibility. That can be, again, an exercise that you have to go through 2, 3, 4 times. But if it's just a couple of people on the phone talking or on a Zoom call, that's a lot less expensive than paying engineers or architects to go through and draw something, only to find out it's really not going to be feasible at your site. We'll get to a couple of examples of what the pro forma looks like in just a little bit. But I wanted to point out that what you're doing is you're walking a fine line here, and that you're making assumptions about what you think you can accomplish, and you're trying to gather as much data as possible. And that goes back to pro forma, meaning we think this is what's going to happen. And you try and increase your certainty as you develop your pre-development plans, as you develop the site plan and the construction and the financial structure of the organization, of the project, so that your organization can make that presentation to its various funding sources and your local community. Pre-development activity eventually does cost some money. While I always encourage people to pursue open and available data sources, even looking at different designs just to get a picture out there for everybody to kind of nod their head, yeah, that's the kind of thing we want to build, or that's the kind of place we want to go to. You do end up having to spend money on consultants at some point in order to get your pro forma bank ready. If those of you that were a part of the first presentation that I did, you know that I like this triangle that shows the three sides of a project. I'm just putting it in here again to remind folks that there's no one or like A, then B, then C. All three of these sides of the project that have to do with the physical attributes of the site, the financial structure, as well as the entity, kind of all rotate around. If I was better at presentations, this triangle would be rotating very slowly. So that there's really no one starting point. You have to be sort of addressing these things as you go along. I'll make these slides available afterwards, and so you don't have to take notes on the diagram here, but it's probably very hard to read these numbers, and that's not the point to read the exact number, but I'm just giving you an example of the three sides of a pro forma: the operating, the construction budget, and then the sources and uses. So the first page that we're looking at here is a sample operating budget. You can see the income based on, this is from a project that I worked on in southern Maine, which is why the 2-bedroom rents are $2,000 a month. And those are proposed operating expenses for the small project. And you can see that it at the very bottom here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, the annual operating expense is just under $7,000 a unit a year. And in that part of Maine, that's fairly common. It might even be a little bit higher in some places where property taxes are more of a burden, or there are expensive utilities that you have to connect to. So that's going to fluctuate. But one of the reasons why I focus on that number is when you're presenting, at least to Maine Housing and certainly to other lenders, they're going to compare, when they're underwriting your project, they're going to compare your initial assumptions about what an operating expense per unit is to the rest of their portfolio or their lending experience in that area. And that's one way, that's maybe the first way, but certainly one way that a bank is going to say, yeah, this project seems reasonable. We'll go a little bit further. We'll listen to more. We'll, go dig into the financials of the borrower, et cetera. But they're going to examine your assumptions in an operating budget, because that has everything to do with how much debt the project can carry. If your operating expenses are artificially low so that you can have room to make a higher loan payment, that's going to raise a flag for a potential lender to say, well, I see that you can carry the loan that you're asking for, but your operating expenses look a little thin. Do you really think you can operate it for X and Y and Z? So we try and encourage our customers, when we're working with them early on in a project, to actually be very conservative on operating expenses until they can go test all of the items, particularly property taxes, insurance, and utilities. Those are the three big volatile items in an operating budget. You can probably dial in a management fee, and you can go find out what an annual financial report from your accountant might be. But really understanding property taxes and insurance. These days, insurance is skyrocketing, and utility costs, depending on whether or not the tenants pay utilities or the landlord pays the utilities. So we really focus a lot on the operating budget initially to really get to a place where we now know here's what the property can cash flow, and then we start talking about how we can get to financing it, which leads eventually to how do we pay for the construction of it. So the second part of the pro forma budget, again, I'm not expecting you to read these numbers, but this is just an illustration of the line items that we try and cover when we're working with someone who is developing a project. Notice that the construction number at the top is certainly the biggest line item in the entire $1.6 million budget, but there are a whole bunch of other things that people often don't think about until they're getting close to closing and someone says, oh, can we see your phase 2 environmental assessment? Oh, wow, we didn't get that
Hey, the
done.
door's
Okay,
locked, Greta.
I'm sorry, say that again. Okay. The unforeseen expenses for that are requirements for a closing can often add, they may only be $3,000 or $4,000 a piece, but if you have, a half a dozen of them, suddenly that's some real money that you have to scramble for right before you're about to close. And don't forget to cover construction period interest. Your banker or your lender will be quick to remind you of that. And then the third part of the pro forma that we're working on is the sources and uses. In this case, we're just illustrating permanent sources, and that's because in this particular project that I lifted this from, Maine Housing is the construction lender, so there's no separation between construction funds and permanent funds. So you can see in this particular project, there's a gap. The developer and or owner is $179,000 short. They were applying for a loan from Maine Housing and some subsidy, and they're putting in $100,000, but there's a gap. And so when you see that, it's not necessarily a stop sign. It means you have to go back and take a look at some of your other assumptions, and that's where you go through, again, the various iterations of sort of dialing these numbers in. And that's something that our technical assistance team is happy to work on with folks as they're kind of trying to iron things out. Oftentimes you get to a place where you've really pushed the rents as high as you think you can go or as high as the funding will allow, and you've got pretty good handle on your construction costs, so you've got a reasonably tight cost estimate from your contractor. And the classic, it is what it is. I'm not really sure where that phrase came from, but it has some gravity here that you really can't change some of that reality. And you can't really borrow any more money, and you've already asked for the maximum amount of subsidy that the program might be allowing for, or you've got a tax credit investor or something else, and you've maxed out what your equity is and you have a gap. That's when you really have to sort of pick your head up out of the numbers and go look for another partner to help you fill that gap. Sometimes that can be a municipality. Sometimes that can be a grant source from an interested party that likes the type of project that you're doing. And sometimes it means you have to go back and re-establish and redesign elements of your construction to make it less expensive so that you can cover that gap with the cost savings. So those are the iterations. It's very much a wheel that goes around, or pages that you kind of keep coming back to, whatever the visual is that you want to see. But it is far from a static document, literally until the week before closing, when your lender and all your other partners are, the music has stopped, everybody has to sit down, and this is the project that we're going to go forward with. But right up until that time, the numbers in a pro forma are dynamic. So again, some of the elements that you'll need to start with, you'll need to know where you are in your community with rents or sales if you're doing a home ownership program. You really want to, sometimes the hardest thing is to guess at early on is what's the operating expense going to be. And without spending a lot of money on a energy load assessment from an engineer to get the utility calculations, you can often just talk to some landlords about similar size properties. Hopefully they're newer properties so that you can compare a new unit to a new unit to get operating expenses, particularly utilities. As I said, you can often get some renderings from available open sources for concept stage drawings, or you can spend very little money with a design professional to just give you a single elevation and a floor plan without going through full development of construction documents. And then also understand that a lender, someone who's making you a loan that you're going to have to pay back, they're generally only going to finance somewhere between 65 and 80% of that cost. So you're going to need other sources in a multifamily or commercial development, and particularly if you're doing new home production for sale units, the bank is going to be even more conservative, and they're going to want to get out of the project fully paid back by the time you're at about 2/3 of the sales. So you're going to have to be making enough money on each of those early sales to be able to fund the last units, because the bank is very likely not going to want to wait around for the last of their construction loan to get paid off as you sell your last house in the development. They want to get out earlier than that to mitigate their risk. So that's probably another discussion about how we find subsidy sources. I covered that a little bit in the last session that we did in February, but it's an ongoing thing, and we're always watching the programs at Maine Housing to some degree with USDA and with HUD to see when there's opportunities for financing. Someone mentioned this was the week for submissions to congressional members for CDS spending requests. That's an excellent way to get subsidy into a project, but it's a long wait. And it's a lot of work to assemble those. And you do all of this work, and then you kind of have to sit for a while before it comes through. And meanwhile, other things are changing with your project. So there's pluses and minuses to each of these funding sources that come together. And that's another reason why the pro forma is a dynamic document that changes and goes through edits and re-edits and re-edits. So I want to get to the conversation. This is just my contact information, and we don't have to spend too much time there, but I want to get to the dialogue back and forth and have an opportunity for you folks to ask questions. And please, if anybody else participating here has insights, I am by far not the only teacher in this room. There's plenty of other folks here who have good information to share. So let's get into the conversation.
Thank you, John. I appreciate that. So with Genesis Foundation, do you work with anyone? Does it matter if it's a private developer or if it's a nonprofit organization?
It does not matter, Jen. The Genesis Fund will work with a for-profit or a nonprofit. Our mission comes through in what the project is doing. So there does need to be at least, generally our threshold is at least half of the units, if it's a housing project, need to meet affordability standards. And specifically, that means the rental units are at least, half of the units are at least targeted to households at 80% median income. And if it's an ownership project, we try and look for at least half of the units being sold to households at or below 120% median income. Not the entire project. We do a lot of mixed income projects, and often those are more readily accepted in the local community. And so we recognize that, and as long as there's at least half of the units are targeted for that affordability, we'll work with anybody. We work with contractors, landowners, conservation trusts, for-profit, nonprofit. We're doing a lot of work with municipalities directly that are forming their own development corporations to try and tackle these issues directly themselves.
Thank you. Bob?
Thanks. So John, I'm Bob Clark. I'm with the Northern Maine Development Commission in Caribou. It's good to finally meet you. I heard a lot about you. You spoke at our housing conference, I believe last year as well. So does Genesis do just multifamily, or do you do some single family development as well?
Great question. We do multifamily in all kinds of different sizes, from 4 units on up to 100 units. We do get involved in single family home production. So we will finance and provide TA to the developer or the builder or the organization that's putting up the units. But Genesis does not get involved in lending to those end user homeowners. We don't have a license to provide home mortgages. That's a regulated industry in Maine, and there's plenty of banks that do that. But we can provide financing or work with a bank and provide gap financing for the development of the project on a for sale basis.
Okay, so we're looking in Heuristic anyway. We have a lot of single family homes that have been abandoned. They've been either foreclosed or people have just moved away, walked away from them. They're really good homes. They got good bones to them, but people have broken the windows. They kind of move in, if you will, and use it as just a shelter. And these are in fairly good neighborhoods too. So like Prescott, we identified like 10 a week or so ago that we could rehab, put back on the market, get it back on the tax rolls, make it available to working families. And so that's kind of where we're going. So
Yeah.
If I'd love to talk with you sometime in more depth about it.
I would welcome that opportunity, Bob. If we have a partner that can sort of be the anchor for that or the director of how that happens, we can assemble capital to allow that to happen for whatever the whether it's foreclosure or abandonment, whatever we need to do to get possession legally of the property in aggregate, and then work on a renovation budget, and then be patient for the resale of those homes. Sure, that's a great way to add units to your community that are a lot less expensive than trying to build something new at
Yeah,
$280,000 or $300,000 a unit.
yeah. So we're putting together a business plan now, and NMDC will be the developer actually. So we've lined up some financing stuff. So I'll let other people talk, but I appreciate your information. I'll circle back with you at some point in time here in the near future to talk about that.
Yeah, welcome that opportunity.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Good. Alan, how about you?
Actually, I'm in listen mode right now. I really appreciate it, John. I've heard good
Wow.
things about your work, and hope that we can do some work on the Blue Hill Peninsula. I know you've already talked with other of my colleagues here, David Zacco, Annie Guppy, Jim Fisher, and Greg Puduk. Maybe they wish to comment further. Thank you.
Thanks. Alex.
Hey, John, good to see you.
Hi, Alex.
Thanks for all this. I came a little late, so excited to see the recording. I have so many questions, but I'm gonna try to narrow it down. You mentioned a lot of towns or some towns are setting up development corps, and you know, I worked a lot with Idaho. They've got a development corp there, and some of the other islands, all the other year-round islands have housing orgs. I'm just curious, what for the towns that you know that are setting up development corps now, I have two questions. Are the towns developing for rental or home ownership? And then I'm just curious about the long-term maintenance of those projects and sort of property management.
Good question. I think it depends on the community. I've seen municipal-driven development corporations do both rental and home ownership. Sometimes it's related to something that Bob was just talking about, where there's dark properties that are already in place, but nobody's living in them, nobody's taking care of them. So that's often the first thing. We're working with the town of Jonesport to try and work on repurposing some former Coast Guard housing in their community that is potentially going to go to auction. So we might be working with the land bank to see if they can provide a role to help that. We're working closely with the town of Washburn on taking possession of a USDA property that's going to expire, and we want to make sure that it stays affordable and gets renovated with a new owner. And there's no housing authority right there in Washburn, so the town said, we'll form a corporation and we'll do it. So that's kind of where it comes from. It's often organic from the ground up, but I've seen it be for both rental and home ownership. And often property management and even asset management can be hired out, and you don't necessarily have to have somebody right in your backyard. Often property managers have regional staff that can travel a little bit. Not a whole lot, but 30, 40 minutes to a property site is not unusual for a property manager to go attend to things at that particular. So that's often a way that the organization doesn't have to build out a staff of 19. It can just be the core group, and then they hire out those services after the property is stabilized and occupied.
Thanks, John. And just a quick follow-up. So it does sound like those property, the development corps maintain ownership over those properties. They don't just develop them and sell them.
Right. Sometimes there is a focus on setting up ownership, but when you get to a municipal entity that's buying and selling real estate, that kind of opens up a whole bunch of charter issues with the municipality. So you want to make sure that the corporation is far enough away from the elected body, so you don't have to have a town meeting in order to sell a house. Avoid those kind of things.
Super helpful. Thanks, John. Really appreciate it.
Amanda Clark put a message in the chat just saying USDA Rural Development Section 502 direct single family housing program allows for the purchase of an existing home with repairs / improvements to be financed in the loan amount and completed after closing. So you can reach out to her if you'd like more info, amanda.burke@usda.gov. So thank you, Amanda. Jim, how about you?
Yeah, I find myself being the bad guy in a situation, and I'm curious if this is common. All the nursing homes in Hancock County have closed, and they're all trying to figure out what to do with those buildings, which are in many cases, in Deer Isle's case, chartered as nonprofit nursing homes. Being as, not even assisted care, just senior apartments. What happens with the nonprofit status? I mean, do we just roll it over to that, or do they have to redefine their nonprofit entity in order to get a tax exemption?
I'm not an expert on that, Jim, but I have seen nonprofits modify their mission and modify their charitable purpose is what the element is in their 501c3, and you can go through as long as it's a transparent process with the board and there's a resolution and there's some record of it, the organization can vote to modify its charitable purpose. It's probably a good idea to get some legal opinion about whether or not the shift from this purpose to that purpose is within the realm of what the IRS considers charitable benefit, community benefits, or not. But I'm going to guess that if you're providing affordable housing to the community, there's plenty of nonprofits that have that as their primary purpose. So that I know that that is an allowable use under a 501c3. So I think it's really just an internal thing that the organization has to go through with a public, with a record of it, in case anybody asks, gee, we're doing this, now you're doing that. Oh yeah, we had a meeting and we went through this and we had a resolution and a vote. And so it's really kind of a mechanical thing to shift. You just want to make sure that that public purpose, the new public purpose, is defined and then represented in what the organization is doing.
So they don't need to go back to the IRS for a new 501c3 determination. No. They can just change their mission, and as long as it looks nonprofitish, they're okay. I just want to be careful we don't start granting status to organizations without them going through a process.
The test is to demonstrate charitable purpose, because the 501c3 specifically is providing a charitable benefit to the community. And so there's plenty of nonprofit organizations that do affordable housing, and that's an acceptable element for 501c3. So you should be okay with that. But get some legal advice for sure.
I was going to say, I know that even just to change an address or something, you still have to do an amendment. You have to at least send a letter to the IRS. This is going on. Is this okay? And they send you back one saying, yeah, you're good.
Right.
So there probably is still some kind of procedure they would need to go through to change their mission in that way. I would think. So Debbie, did you have something? You just muted if you do. Okay, anyone else?
I have a somewhat, I guess, kind of related, but somewhat unrelated question. I think I'm interested to get your opinion on who might be missing from these tables. Who would you like to see engage more with this process?
With the process of developing the pro forma?
Right. Well, with the process in general and going through the financing process, do you see anybody at all that's missing that you'd like to see more engagement from? Any groups?
Well, I think the starter for that, Kristen, is that at some point, a community group that is doing X and Y and are now pursuing a development project for, let's say it's affordable housing, or could be a food bank or child care center. If there's a piece of real estate that's either going to be renovated or built, there really is a pretty tangible need for someone or some small group to act as developer, because the developer is, to use a tired analogy, the orchestra leader. They don't have to know how to play the trumpet, and they don't have to know how to read the score for the harp, but they have to know how all of those pieces come together. So the assembly of the pro forma pages starts with sort of getting the project on planet Earth, but a developer is really the one that's going to drive or steer those iterations and start bringing in the various partners that you'll need. And at some point, that does mean someone, whether it's the developer or the organization, does have to start spending some money before the project bank closing or lender closing in order to get the designs, in order to have all the questions about the site figured out, whether it's geotechnical on the soils, whether it's hazardous materials in an existing building or a structural assessment of an old property. The developer is really going to be the agent that coordinates all of that. So that's probably the key element of the team. And again, that can be an organic thing that comes from the ground up locally. If someone has those skill sets and can take the leadership role. And then there's other places where you can go to try and sort of buy that service from a developer agent or a developer consultant. Oftentimes, a developer consultant will have lots of expertise, but probably is not going to put their money at risk. They're going to rely on somebody else to pay for those things. That's the distinction between a developer and a developer consultant. The consultant will come in and tell you everything you need to do and point it out and introduce you to the architect and the engineer and whoever else you need to talk to. But they're going to be providing advisory and probably not paying for that out of their own pocket unless they're going to have some sort of a stake, financial stake in the project down the road. And that could be either a developer fee or an ownership slice in the project. So the developer agent will provide all of those services and then earn a developer fee. Most of the financing structures will allow a reasonable 10 to 15% of total cost developer fee to pay for those services. And the risk that the developer takes often is that they have to put all that money out ahead of time before they get paid. And so that's part of the negotiation back and forth.
Alex, you had something?
I don't know if that answered your question, but.
Thanks for that, John. That's really helpful. We have a lot of small business owners around here that would like to do housing, and I think developer consultant is always helpful in that regard. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. My question isn't so much around financing, but just wondering what resources you might recommend to help set up a nonprofit or a development corp. A lot of towns kind of could use some extra capacity in thinking about that. Jim's question is like a perfect one regarding that kind of support they might need. Are there any resources out there aside from like private consultants or obviously law firms?
Yeah, for the establishment on the entity side, that really comes from generally somebody's pocket who's interested in seeing it come forward. I don't know of any particular programs. Occasionally, you might get lucky and stumble across a philanthropy or a foundation that might sort of believes in your image or your vision of the project and wants to see it happen and might provide a little bit of $5,000 or $10,000 in seed capital to go pay for an attorney to draft up this or that kind of thing. But I don't know of any particular programs. I've seen municipalities recently get very creative in where they're finding sources of funds. Depending on the size of the community, the last couple of years, there was a flow of ARPA, American Rescue Plan Act money that made a lot of small things happen because that was a new source of funds that many communities and certainly county governments in Maine had never seen before. And so they were able to do some things that they hadn't been able to do before. All that's dried up or been expended at this point. I've seen communities use small residual amounts from a TIF account from their capture in a TIF district. And then occasionally, if a community is forward thinking and proactive, they can apply to the state for CDBG funds to do certain activities, and certainly creating an entity like that is one of those things that you could do with CDBG funds, but it usually has to be in the context of a specific project.
Yeah. All right. Great. Thanks, John. Appreciate that.
John, Jim Fisher put a message in the chat asking if there's or mentioning it would be helpful to have spreadsheet formatted templates for the pro forma documents. Is that something that you have at hand by any chance?
Yeah, the spreadsheet that I shared in the presentation, I can just send a blank one along with the slides when I send them over to you, Jen and Kristen, and then you can circulate the slide deck that, you know, as a PDF. To it to have it be a little more user friendly, but that's a template that Maine Housing uses for its smaller projects. You can certainly get more complex, but you know, if you're involved with a project that has tax credits, whether it's federal tax credits or a state tax credit or the historic rehab tax credit or an energy tax credit, those get much more complicated because you're often tracking investor benefits and the value of things as well as what's happening with the actual real estate. But for a smaller community-based project, usually in multifamily housing, not a commercial rented space, this pro forma template would be useful. I do have some others if someone's looking at just a commercial real estate rental, like if you were going to put up a building and you're going to have a childcare operation move in, there wouldn't be a whole lot of changes to this pro forma, but it would be a little bit different for a commercial operation. So I can happily send those along.
Thank you. Alan.
Yeah, thanks, John. Pivoting back to your answer to Alex, could you elaborate on community development block grants? You said that's something for a forward-thinking community, and I'm wondering if there are any constraints in terms of minimum size of a community. I mean, obviously, you know, we're talking about towns that have 800 people in them. So what's the community development block grant opportunity for towns that are really small?
It may be the best effort to go on a micro regional. So a town a pretty small town staff, and they may not have the bandwidth to handle the assembly, the application, and reporting that's required. But if you got a couple of towns together, DECD, who handles the community block grant at the state level, their applications, they love to see municipalities cooperating. And they have really good staff there at DECD to help towns organize. I say forward thinking because the DECD application is once a year. So you have to be prepared to be looking ahead and have something in, you know, kind of coming together now. Those applications together, and a couple of communities working together for a single project or a distributed project that's going to benefit the area, and you can get a consultant. Those can be very successful applications. Oftentimes, they're related to infrastructure to kind of set the table for bigger projects to happen. So that can be utility infrastructure. It can be transportation infrastructure. It could mean the construction of a building that's going to then be leased out for occupancy by a food pantry or a childcare center or a job training place, or, you know, whatever it might be. So that's there's a number of different pathways that you can assemble your project around the CDBG goals.
And I see Deb has her hand up, so
Yes, that's what I was going to say, Deb.
Thanks. I thought I was on the anonymous list, but then I see. So yeah, good answers, John, all with some caveats. And you hit the most important thing is actually the most important thing is people like Jen who and Kristen who are CDBG TA providers. The first thing communities should do is, if they've got an idea about something, is to talk with your regional planning commission, your EDD, whoever it is in your neck of the woods that has those folks. On our website, we have a list of TA providers. Go to them first. That's what they're there for. They're a partner in the field. They know your communities best. But yeah, what matters is you've got to have a vision. You've got to, what is your vision? What do you want to do? And start small with the idea, get a group together that form a little committee. And then depending on what the project is, we've narrowed down our activities because our money is never guaranteed, especially in these times. But as long as it's a low mod benefit, especially if we're talking housing, it can take many shapes and forms. And the CAP agencies are out there. They do single family home repair for us. So that way the communities don't have to worry about that. If you've got somebody needs some of that assistance, you go to the CAP agency directly. But we partnered with many. In fact, we're partnering with Genesis on a lot of their projects right now to prevent closing of affordable housing projects. But yeah, we've done school renovations. We've done the nursing home. I don't think we've done a nursing home yet, but that's probably coming down the pike. The challenge is when you use federal dollars is it comes with all of the federal requirements. And that is a lot of bureaucratic. It's not insurmountable, but it is a little bit of an issue. So you've got to have some expertise. So that's why start with your regional planning commission TA provider. And then as always, you can always call us at our office and float an idea. And we do that all the time. So yeah, it's and John, might as well put you on staff now.
I didn't know you were on the call, Deb. It's great to have you
I
here.
figured that. I said, oh, I better chime in.
And just as
Very
kind of an
helpful.
aside to this, the Maine Community Development Association acts as an advisory group for the CDBG program. So having that link to MCDA can also be helpful.
And also a future MCDA meeting to float ideas. I mean, there's an agenda item that if people want to say, okay, we're going to do the spaghetti on the wall meeting. This is what we're thinking about. People could talk back and forth, and we could, just sort of brainstorm. That's not a bad use of time. As I've found out many times, is sometimes the best ideas come out of just throwing things around. So to be discussed in the future. But yeah, MCDA is a good group. And like I said, go to your TA providers. If you have an inkling of idea, go to them first, talk to them, and then call us, because we talk about potentials, future things all the time.
Do we have any other questions for John? So Alex mentioned in the chat that they're also a CDBG TA provider in Lincoln County. So if anyone here is from Lincoln County, Alex is your person to call. Well, there, quiet group. Actually, it's been good conversation. So John, thank you very much. I really appreciate the
You're quite welcome.
information that you've given to us in both of these sessions. So Kristen, I don't know if you want to chime in, but we are, or if you want to just mention something. But the group that had pulled these sessions together has been working on doing some planning around training events and that sort of thing. We're looking at another series. I'm not sure exactly when it's going to start, but it will be at some point in the relatively near future. So Kristen?
Yeah, so I just wanted to mention a little bit more about that series. This series will be a little more inclusive than what we have here. Although this has been very informational, this series, we're looking at a series of almost master classes to put into practice the things that we've learned, the topics that we've learned about throughout the speaker series. So please watch your emails for that as soon as we have it a little more together and have some dates. We will send out information on how to access those quote unquote master classes. So I think, Alan, do you have a question for John?
I do. Actually, it's a question. I don't know for whom. Glad we're looking ahead, but I missed John's first presentation. I was wondering if those slides could be emailed back to.
So if you go to maincda.org, which is
Yeah.
the Maine Community Development Association website,
Yep.
click on the link that says training, you'll find recordings of all of the sessions in this series, as well as the presentations and any additional handouts the presenter sent along to include.
Perfect. Thanks.
Well, there, I think we're 6 minutes early, so not too bad for a Wednesday morning. But John,
Great.
again, thank you very much. Debbie, thank you for
Right.
the additional information about the CDBG program as well. And I hope everyone has a lovely rest of your day.
Right. Thanks all.
Thanks. Bye-bye.